one veteran of the Iraq War, a woman named Michelle Dillow, who's given me permission to use her name, really changed my way of thinking. She was at Missouri State University. She signed up for the military because she needed money to pay for college, and she was going to get training in certain skills and so on. And then she was sent to Iraq. She came back. And here's what she told me. And by the way, I'm going to talk more about this in a few minutes, but what some people keep referring to as my interviews with veterans, they weren't interviews, they were just listening. I asked almost nothing. But what she said was this. She had been asked to speak to an MSU course on the history of war before she went. Then she came back. 2 years later, she's asked to speak to the same course. And she said she got up to speak, and she just couldn't do what she'd done 2 years before. She said, 2 years ago when I was here, I spoke the Army's book, but I can't do that anymore. And then she started talking about how they told her, you won't see combat. You'll just learn vehicle repair. Vehicle repair. In Iraq, vehicles that had been blown up by IEDs, and there were bits of the service members who had been in those vehicles all over the pieces of the Jeep. So that's the kind of thing she went through. And then she talked to this class. She'd never met them. She talked to the members of this class about how she's not handling it well. Since she got back from Iraq, she said, I used to be so nice. I used to have lots of friends. I used to go out and have a good time. I can't do that anymore. There are a million miles between me and my family and my friends. I feel rage all the time. I don't know what's wrong with me. And she was one of the people who said, I saw a therapist and she was a nice lady, but I don't live in her office. When she was giving this talk to this class full of strangers and berating herself for not handling it all well, somebody in the back of the class called out, I think you're being too hard on yourself. She allowed me to tell her story in a short play I wrote called War and Therapy. I'm going to read you some excerpts in a minute. But she told me that when that student said that, she went home, and that night, for the first time since she got back from Iraq, she slept. And I hear that all the time, that kind of story, that when somebody in the community reaches out and connects, just offers to be there. Of course, it doesn't fix everything, but it's the beginning of healing. It's friendship, it's community, it's human connection. Now, before I read some bits of War and Therapy, I want to talk a little bit about the problem of diagnosis. The most used diagnosis for war veterans is PTSD. And as you probably know, the idea for creating the category of post-traumatic stress disorder was well motivated. It was very movingly motivated. The point was, people were coming back from Vietnam, and they were emotionally wrecked, and nobody was paying attention. And so the people who created the category and then got it in the DSM were trying to get people to pay attention and to say, this is serious, these people need help. Well, but what's the last part of the title of the DSM? Mental disorders. So at the beginning, as you may know, at the beginning, when PTSD first went in the DSM, there was a little sentence that said, this is a normal reaction, or it's a kind of reaction that anybody would have to an abnormal or horrific situation. All right, well, that's good, but then why is it in a diagnosis of mental disorders handbook? But at least there was that sentence. Now that sentence isn't there anymore. So I did an interview with Brian Lehrer in New York on NPR, and a psychiatrist called in. And he said, you're saying that these vets aren't mentally ill, that it's a disease. And I said, what do you mean it's a disease? And he said, well, a disease. I mean, a disease is when some part of your body is broken. So like their minds are broken. And I said, well, that's interesting. So you want to call the reactions that people are having to having been at war and trying to come home to a totally different culture, you want to call those mental illness. So maybe you can tell me what exactly would be a healthy response to war. And he just kind of babbled. Some of the other problems with PTSD. The word war is not in there. Post-traumatic stress disorder. So, you got that diagnosis, you could have been raped, you could have been in a tsunami, you could have been hit by a bus, you could have been at war. These are all horrible experiences, but they're different. And you need the people you care about not to forget the specifics of what you've been through and why you're in the shape that you're in. In the Civil War, do you know what they called this kind of emotional upset because of war? They called it soldier's heart. Okay, soldier, there's a war word. And then in subsequent wars, what have they called it? Listen for the war words. Combat fatigue, shell shock, war trauma. And all of a sudden now we've got this hygienic, this cover-up, PTSD. Not to mention the fact that, look at the word stress. In the play War and Therapy, the therapist says at one point that stress is when you're late for a meeting and you're caught in a traffic jam. Stress. What words really describe what it's like to be at war? Well, the poets and the novelists know what words to use, and there's some of the words that I've used before. So we distance ourselves from them when we say they have PTSD. No, they have grief. They have terror. They have shame. They have experienced a tremendous loss of innocence. They are experiencing existential, spiritual, moral anguish. That's different from PTSD. And can you think of giving somebody a drug for moral anguish? But that's what happens. So, let me just do a bit of some excerpts from War and Therapy. It's two people. The therapist is called Dr. Pauk. I named Dr. Pauk after a psychiatrist I saw when I was in graduate school in clinical psych in a PhD program. So I told him, and he said, "You don't have weak ego." But see, here is this perfect example of the traditional mental health system. I mean, these were 9 white male psychology clinicians who decided I had weak ego boundaries because I wanted to connect. Dangerous. So Dr. Pauk, in the play, she's a woman, but sometimes played by a man. And then it's a woman veteran in the play. Those are the two characters. Dr. Pauk says, I had 4 years of grad school, a 1-year internship, and 30 years of practicing therapy, and I can tell you in about 4 minutes everything I learned that's ever been of use to anyone. See, we're supposed to help people, and we're supposed to know more about people than they know about themselves. But in all those years, not once did any of my teachers or my colleagues say, we know that's scary. Just do the best you can. Nobody said, none of us knows more about patients than they know about themselves. We just know some things. Can I be the only one who's terrified of not being able to help? Of actually doing someone harm? And then later, she says to the audience, see, putting a label on somebody doesn't help you help them. It even gets in the way, stops you from seeing the person. And then how much more true is that of somebody who's been at war? Because we don't know how to even think about what they've been through. And I can tell you, every time I listen to a vet's story, I think at the beginning, well, I'm not going to hear anything new. I'm not going to hear any new kind of story about what war is like. And every time I hear another one. And then Dr. Pauk says, when waves of veterans came back from Vietnam emotionally devastated, therapists said, we'll call that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and send them to us for therapy and drugs. Today, all the Vietnam and Gulf War vets, and now the ones from Iraq and Afghanistan, all those that we've treated, there are so many who still, by God, are homeless, jobless, addicted to drugs, jailed for murder, and how many are killing themselves. Then later, Julia, the vet, rushes in. She's mad at the therapist because the therapist isn't helping her. She knows she's nice, but she's not helping her. And Julia has just heard somebody from the VA talking on the radio, and she says, I'm not crazy. I've just got PTSD, and you damn well should have told me that. I won't tell you anything I don't believe. then what you believe is wrong. You say you want to help me, so cure this. It's not that simple, Julia. To say that someone has PTSD is a way of saying they've been through hell. So I've been through nothing? Nothing's wrong with me? Of course something is wrong. People who lost their homes in Katrina nearly died from grief. Right. What's happened to you is at least as powerful as that. That's not stress. Stress is getting caught in a traffic jam when you're late for a meeting. Stress doesn't begin to capture what you feel. Cure my PTSD. Saying you have PTSD is saying you're mentally ill. But I am mentally ill. But what you feel is normal. I should have been over this by now. I'm home, I'm safe, but I don't feel like it, and I don't act like it. You got to admit, that's out of touch. You may never get over it. You can't wipe out those memories. It makes sense to feel unsafe. I cannot live like this. I want to get back to where I was just given a name. The name is pain. Calling it something else does not help. You may never get back to where you were before. You've been to war. That changes you. You've lost your innocence. You have to grieve. The shrink on the radio, he wants to believe he knows what's right. So do you. Julia, think about all the Vietnam vets who got their diagnoses and are still suffering all these decades later. But it hurts. Call it that. Call it pain and fear and grief. I want to call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes, because that sounds clean and clinical. For one moment you feel relief, but after that it will do you nothing but harm. Keep you thinking you should be fine by now. That will keep you from finding peace. You have to accept the tenderness in you that makes you care. You've seen things no one is wired to endure. PTSD feels better than this wildness inside me. But the wildness and the desperation, the aloneness, are what you feel. Later, the doctor says to her, I'm doing my best here, but the track record for therapists and vets is not very good. Look, all that terror you felt over there, the confusion, needing to be tough, that was the worst of horrors, and it will always be in there somewhere. But we have to find some ways to get you some calm, some peace. Oh, and how will that happen, huh? The sounds of those explosions, the look of blown-off flesh, the smell of that flesh, the jagged metal fragments of what used to be a Jeep. Those are in me now. Now they make me who I am. And later, the vet walks out. She's so exasperated. And Dr. Pauk says to the audience, I don't know what to do. I cannot fix it. The shock of confronting the human capacity for violence. God damn it, it's presumptuous to think that I can say to somebody who's looked at evil head on, I can make you better. And then later, toward the end of the play, the vet explains to the therapist that she started sleeping. And she tells, in the play, you see the vet speaking to the class. And then you don't hear what the student says. You just see the vet reacting. And she says, I what? You think I'm... Why would you even... Too hard on myself? You think? So then after that, she asked to meet with a therapist, and she says, you know, I spoke to that class that night, and it's been 2 weeks, and from that very night, I'm sleeping every night. And the therapist says, well, what was it? She says, well, the student, and then she tells her what she said. She said I was being too hard on myself. And the therapist says, that's what I said to you. And the vet says, yeah, but you're the therapist. And she says, that student taught me it might just be safe for me out here. That student is the world. All right, so somebody from the community with this simple human gesture made all the difference. Our training too often deprives us of our humanity. I told you about being told I had weak ego boundaries. When I was in my first full job after I got my PhD, which I got despite being kicked out of the program. It's a long story, but anyway. Oh, by the way, I wrote an article in Feminism and Psychology. It's called, there's a book they did called Feminist Foremothers, and I wrote an article called Weak Ego Boundaries, One Developing Feminist Story. And so I can tell you that naming names and telling your story, you know, I wasn't at war, but it was pretty upsetting what happened, and just putting it on paper, just saying it, made a big difference for me. Well, anyway, then I moved to Toronto, and I'm working at the Family Court Clinic, and Harvey Armstrong, a psychiatrist, is my team leader. And when a Native American mother who had her child taken away from her, totally unjustly, she didn't want to come to the clinic anymore because we weren't helping her. She needed her kid back. And that was something I couldn't make happen. I was trying, and I hadn't succeeded. I didn't blame her for wanting to come in. So I told Harvey in our next supervision session that I had gone to the place where she lived, and she only had one chair in the whole place, and she wanted me to sit in it, like I'm gonna, right? So we sat on the floor and we talked, and I told him that when I got up to leave, she hugged me. Now, I had found this very moving, but Harvey explained that this was very unprofessional, and that the reason she hugged me was because I'm too motherly. Okay, and so yeah, one of my books is called Don't Blame Mother. Anything associated with mothers gets put down, right? So being warm, being expressive, being respectful is not supposed to happen. Okay, I have to leave some time for Q&A. Let me just do two things really quickly. This is really important. Okay. In the book, I talk about the importance of listening, and I suggest that we have the Welcome Johnny and Jane Home project. It doesn't cost a thing. I want us to go from being a war-illiterate nation to a nation where everybody knows what war really is, and the way to do it is to have every civilian listen to a veteran's story. And in the book, I mean, this is all it amounts to. All you really have to do is say, find a vet and say, as an American whose government sent you to war, I take some responsibility for what you have been through at war and trying to come home. And so if you want to talk, I will listen for as long as you want me to listen. And then just listen. And I have to tell you one quick story about what happened when I listened. You know what my politics are. There was an Iraq war vet. He was completely blown up, could not go back to war. He was sitting there and he was telling me that he went there to protect our country and his wife, and he went there to liberate Iraq, and an old Iraqi man had thanked him, and he would go back in a minute if they'd let him. And I didn't say anything, I just listened. And then he said, but every night before I try to go to sleep, I hear a woman scream. And I didn't say anything. And he said, and that's because there was a woman across the street from where we were, and we thought she had explosives and was going to blow us up. And so I killed her. And then I didn't say anything, and he said, and it turned out she did have explosives, and she was going to blow us up. And I didn't say anything, and he said, but every night I hear her scream because I wasn't raised to kill. Now, that's the kind of pain that's out there. They can't bear it on their own. We have to listen to them. And the only thing I urge you to say, if you're a therapist, forget about interpreting, forget about theories, forget about anything, just listen with your whole heart. We did a study at Harvard last summer, and the vets that we listened to said they were able to say things they'd never been able to say before. And we asked the civilian non-therapists who did the listening what it was like for them. And this is really important because this is what's in it for you if you listen to a veteran's story and urge your friends to do the same. The civilians said, I discovered we had so much in common. So what we learned from that is that if you know you're a civilian and they're a vet, the default assumption is too often we must be different in every conceivable important way. And discovering your common humanity is what matters. A wise man named Tony Smith said to me recently, and I'm wrapping this up, He said, I work with prison inmates and starving women because I do not like who I am when I become disconnected from them. I'm disconnected from my own humanity. We as a country, we keep going to war, and we don't know what the hell that means. And we need to connect with our own humanity by listening to these people who have confronted life and death and who have survived it but who are in pain. I listen to veterans and I learn over and over again the astonishing power of listening. I learn that power. I learn more about humanity, and I bring that then to my children, my grandchildren, my mother, and others whom I love. Whatever their politics and whatever mine are, I learn magnificent things about human beings that otherwise I'd miss. So listening brings us into the fullness, the wholeness of life. Do we want to know life or only a part of it? Veterans are the forward observers. My father was a forward observer during World War II. He used to tell stories about the Battle of the Bulge, and I never could remember the stories from one year to the next. And one time somebody videotaped him, and I was watching the videotape, and when he said, I was a forward observer, I had to turn off the TV. I burst into tears. Forward observer. It finally got through to me after all those years. He was the one up front, the most in danger. The vets who are alive today are the forward observers about where we are going as human beings, where this country is going, where we're going if we don't do something to stop the war. And the best way to start is to learn about what war really is. So let me just wrap up by saying, to listen to a vet's story is painful, and you may have trouble sleeping at night, but it matters. C. Clinton Seidel wrote in a Huffington Post piece that awareness and compassion make up the two inseparable aspects of basic goodness. With awareness, you become more compassionate. You know, we think of ourselves as compassionate because we're here. But I tell you, there's more compassion to find in yourself. So when we listen to veterans and others who suffer, let's think about Seidel's words. He says, lean into your discomfort, that discontent. Allow the quality of what you are feeling to penetrate your heart, and then the truly indestructible you begins to emerge. My father, my late father, wrote an essay when he was in high school. It was about his philosophy of life, and he coined the term unselfish self-satisfaction, explaining that it's rewarding to be helpful to others. So what happens is that when we listen to veterans, when we let them share their pain, and when we, and this is the one thing I urge everybody to say if you listen to a veteran's story, find the opportunity to say to them, after what you just told me, if I had been through that, I would be feeling the way you do. And I hope you know that's not a mental illness. You are not crazy. That's a normal, understandable human reaction. And the vets will tell you that changes everything for them. So we are simply discovering what's already there when we listen to them. But we have this huge part of our country that's unconscious, that we're unaware of, until we listen. So Judy Chicago wrote, if we do this kind of thing, then all that has divided us will merge, and then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. So let us think about Kafka's words, a book should serve as the axe for the frozen sea within us. Let's think the same of listening, that it will serve as the axe for whatever is frozen within us, or at least as the spyglass that helps us discover what we still don't know about ourselves. And in so doing, let's make this a nation that cares.